So here's the drill. You live in a market economy in which, whether your philosophical inclination is comfortable with it or not, real estate is a commodity. It's an investment commodity. And it's subject to all the pressures of supply and demand, just like any other commodity is, like oil. And when you make one of the best products, you shouldn't be surprised that people want to buy it. So there will always be an affordability problem here, to some extent.
In the 19th century, that came with the Industrial Revolution and the development of the economies in the U.S. in particular, was what has been called classical liberalism. And it really was one of us that said that the state has a very limited role to play, that it's the market that is the center, as I've said here, the market rules.
So my hope is more pinned on more unusual collaborations. So let me give you just one example of something we've been discussing at City Hall, but we've never had the gumption yet to make it happen. But I still have faith that it might. For SRO replacement housing in the downtown east side, is there a way to bring private investor equity to the table? Perhaps you might call it a socially responsible investment opportunity. Buy a unit, put it into a low-income rental pool, and then take your profits from capital gains when you sell the unit.
Public funding means debt service. Private funding means lease obligations. There's still future obligations, but we want obligations that are going to be lower in cost. And we have to recognize that if there's benefits in risk transfer, we should look at the lowest cost way of achieving that risk transfer. We shouldn't be giving the projects to the private sector saying that's the only way we can achieve the risk transfer we're looking for. For example, in the RAV project, I'll never forget listening to a report saying the RAV costs are going up, but it's okay, the private sector is going to contribute more. They'll fill the gap. They'll enable us to build projects that we couldn't otherwise afford. The problem with that, of course, is that these projects aren't built on spec. You don't see SNC Lavalin building a rapid transit project and selling the service on the marketplace. These projects are built on the basis of a very long-term lease with government, and that long-term lease provides the revenues that pays for the capital that the private sector puts in. And that long-term lease establishes a liability. Taxpayers have to pay over the next 25 years, provided the service is there, the infrastructure is developed, they have to pay that lease payment. So it's much like a decision with respect to a house. Instead of buying the house and taking out a mortgage yourself, you have somebody else pay for the house for you. But if you enter into a 25-year lease obligation, or you're stuck with that lease, you have to pay that, you have a long-term liability. And now accountants recognize that there is no magic bullet. There is no off-book financing of public infrastructure. We can't get the private sector to build projects we couldn't otherwise afford. They are, these P3s, a public debt, though in a different form, in the form of a long-term lease, every bit as much as a direct government debt.
My point is that if everyone pitches in, it becomes a real collaboration, not a public-private partnership. Forget those words. But a real collaboration among all people in all sectors of our society to deal with this issue.
I mean, it's semantics. As soon as you talk about the state buying land and the state building housing and the state introducing an allocation and pricing mechanism, you're talking about non-market housing, because that's not how the market works.
And I hope that this example, admittedly, I will tell you up front, Cameron Gray is here and he knows this better than anyone, that we haven't worked out all the glitches in this, but I hope it does see the light of day in the next several years. I think it could deliver a lot of desperately needed units, taking advantage of that frenetic investor climate that we do have in the city to replace those rickety old hotels. And not only that, it could be very applicable to more modest and middle-income accommodation as well. And this is only one example. I'm thinking about revolving social housing investment funds and community development corporations and other models to facilitate these kinds of collaborations and to bring more players and, more to the point, more equity to the table, not just government equity.
It's not about a way to avoid debt. It's not about a way to build things that we couldn't otherwise afford, because if you can't afford to do it yourself, you can't afford to do it through a P3. You still have the same long-term obligation.
In a market economy, price is driven by demand. It's demand pulled, not price or cost pushed. And just because you make the unit 25 cents cheaper doesn't mean it's going to sell for 25 cents less, because when demand is strong, prices go up, and they're not a function of cost necessarily. That's why you won't hear me or most other people running around saying, gee, if I could get a building permit for $100 instead of $200, the units would be cheaper. No, they wouldn't. Land values would go up, perhaps, but unit prices would stay where they are.
I think there is also a lot of opportunity in variations of housing tenure. If you take the quote-unquote housing as investment out of the equation, then affordability flows right back in. That's why most social housing is rental, and that's a good thing. At the same time, I think we would all agree that the co-op model can be much more fully exploited as an alternative to either rental or ownership.
Governments get very low, very attractive financing rates. So when we go to a privately financed highway or a privately financed RAB project in part, we're giving up the benefit of that low cost, that low interest rate. Yet in the value for money assessment of the Sea to Sky project, what Partnerships BC did is make the assumption that regardless of what the actual interest rate government would pay in its traditionally procured project, it's going to assume it's the exact same cost as the cost of capital that the private sector incurs, which in that particular case was 7.5%. And in the case of the traditional government financing right now, I don't know the exact rates, but I'm pretty sure it'd be 5% or less, which makes a huge difference. These are capital projects. It's all about the interest rates. And when you talk about another 2.5 percentage points on a $500 or $600 million project, you're talking $10 million a year or more.
Unfortunately, too many people win as prices skyrocket. How many people in this room have actually smiled with happiness as your homes have become much more and more valuable? But in the end, we have to also realize that too many people lose. And mostly, it's our children. And mostly, it's those around us who are least advantaged. If we want to enjoy the boom, we'd better make sure that others of our fellow citizens, and especially members of our families, are not victimized by that same boom. Thank you very much.
Around about 1,000 units a year, maybe a bit more. But the other point to make is that government is not going to meet all of the housing needs of everyone in the province. It really requires.
Why not?
It really requires a strong role for the private market and government to focus its resources on those most in need. Government can't spend enough money to satisfy all of the need. So
Because it doesn't have the money?
part of the strategy has to be to work with the private sector. The private sector provides 95% of the housing in British Columbia. That market needs to continue to operate as efficiently as it can. And that's why there's a focus on taxation and deregulation so that the private sector can help meet more and most of the need in British Columbia, and then the government focuses its resources on those most in need, like the project with the Union Gospel Mission, like the project with the Dr. Peter Yates Foundation.
Housing, we have more homeless than we've ever had before. We have a property endowment fund filled full of hundreds of millions of dollars. That money should be put to work housing people.